So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another Talks at Google event. And this event is very near and dear to many of us here at Google. The idea of preserving cultural patrimony, digitizing manuscripts, organizing the world's information. In today's instance, Joshua Hammer here is here to talk to us about the BAD-ASS Librarians of Timbuktu. Now, I do want to preface this entire conversation by saying that I personally think that all librarians are badass in their own right, but these in particular. Joshua traces the story of many heroes who worked to preserve the written legacy of Timbuktu as the library was ransacked during civil strife. And so he will go into that story. He's also the author of numerous other books and articles, including Yokohama Burning. And we'll have time for some questions at the end. So please join me in welcoming Joshua to Google. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. What I thought I would do is, and I've honed this after a couple of book talks in New York, give you a little rundown of the arc of this story and how I happened to come to it, and then I will accompany that with some pictures so you can get a sense of what this very unusual, desolate, but somehow beautiful part of the world is all, what it looks like, what it's all about. And then I would read a couple of passages and then ask you if you have any questions. So, Timbuktu, how did I come upon this place? I was Newsweek's Africa bureau chief in the 90s. And kind of had carte blanche to travel all across sub-Saharan Africa, basically doing whatever I wanted to do in the days when that kind of journalism was still, when newsweeklies and other media organizations had deep pockets and could let their correspondents just wander the world. So a couple of colleagues and I in 1995 went to Timbuktu. We chartered a small plane in Bamako, the capital, and flew up there for 2 hours because it was expensive to charter your own airplane. And they weren't that generous. So we flew in and we wandered the streets of this ancient town, desolate town. There was a war going on. A Tuareg, the nomadic people known as the Tuaregs, were in revolt, and so there were no tourists. There was basically no transportation in or out. We managed to get in there and wandered and saw the mud huts where the explorers from the early 19th century had stayed when they managed to get into Timbuktu back then, and where one of them had been executed after it was found that he was not a Muslim. So it was a desolate, kind of depressing place, but it also obviously had this incredibly rich, legendary history behind it, and I was definitely hooked right then and there. Then 10 years later, I left Newsweek and went freelance and began looking around for ideas, always on the search for ideas to keep working. Came across a small item about these manuscripts from the Middle Ages that had been rediscovered in and around Timbuktu, and that the article went on to say that there was an effort led by a couple of librarians to collect them. I don't think digitization was yet part of the process at that point, but it was simply collecting them, restoring them, building libraries, and trying to show them to the world. Definitely caught my attention given my previous trip to Timbuktu and my interest in literature and the preservation of manuscripts and cultural patrimony. Called an editor at Smithsonian Magazine, which does that kind of thing, exactly what would appeal to them. And within a week, I was on another plane up to Timbuktu. This is what I confronted. This is the Sankare Mosque, which was built in the 14th century, the typical architecture of that period when it was really a unique architecture that's sort of influenced by the Egyptian pyramids, but given its own kind of North African motif. Streets look like that, mix of mud brick and limestone, and better houses were made of these limestone bricks, as you see. Mud alleys, not the kind of grand city paved with gold that that had lured the Europeans in the early 19th century. Another shot of the oldest neighborhood of Timbuktu, Sankare, it's called. During that trip, I met this gentleman, Abdel Kader Haidara. He was the most charismatic figure in Timbuktu in this manuscript effort. What he had done single-handedly, practically, was to rediscover this incredible tradition of manuscript writing that had flourished in Timbuktu in the 15th and 16th centuries. This desolate place had 500 years ago been at the center of the commerce and cultural life of that period in northern Africa. It was a place where the river met the desert, where the highest bend of the Niger River, the third longest river in Africa, met the Sahara. So you had this constant stream of transport, of commercial transport, coming from across the Sahara Desert from as far away as Europe, bringing textiles, clothing, whatever came out of that part of the world. Then river traffic coming up from sub-Saharan Africa, bringing everything from cola nuts to slaves. It was a big slave trading port, to gold. So over the centuries, this outpost in the middle, at the very edge of the Sahara, became an incredibly wealthy place. At the same time, under a couple of enlightened rulers, it became a center of intellectuality, of scholasticism. Universities were founded in the 15th and 16th centuries. Thousands of students came to Timbuktu from all across the Arab world. An industry creating manuscripts was founded around 1400 or 1500 or so. In between that period, you had hundreds of scribes churning out using beautiful calligraphy and beautiful colors and beautiful patterns and designs, the works that range from Qurans, the Hadith, the sayings of the Prophet, to secular works, including works of astronomy, works of medicine, poetry, guides to orgasm, you name it, everything could be found in Timbuktu. How-to books, I should say, how-to books about sex. That was a real popular seller in about 1550. So this incredible trade flourished for 100 years or so during this golden era of Timbuktu. It showed a kind of Islam that was tolerant, open, cross-cultural, multicultural, open to ideas, able to synthesize both religion and science in a unique way. It lasted, as I said, for about a century, and then in the late 16th century, about 1591, Moroccan invaders swept across the Sahara, conquered Timbuktu, took many of these scholars and scribes into captivity. A lot of them were became members of the resistance against the colonial occupiers. So they were either killed or enslaved and dragged across the desert back to Morocco, where they spent either the rest of their lives or years in captivity. That pretty much ended Timbuktu's reign as the center of scholasticism of this part of the world. At the same time, trade routes were changing. This whole desert trade was no longer that important. And as time went on, Timbuktu kind of faded into insignificance and became this, as I have said, this desolate outpost that the Europeans stumbled into in the 19th century. And they got there, as I said, having heard these legends about the city of gold, and stumbled upon this place that was pretty much, well, you saw the pictures before, just a dusty, poor, monochromatic, pretty insignificant place. So there was tremendous joy at having reached Timbuktu, but at the same time, great disappointment. Abdel Kader Haidara had a unique story, a pretty extraordinary story. This gentleman was the son of a scholar in Timbuktu, became interested in Timbuktu's lost literary tradition as a young man, as a teenager. And I should also point out that not only did Timbuktu become a desolate place, poverty-stricken place, but the whole tradition of literature, of learning, was lost to the point where Enlightenment philosophers in Europe, Hegel, Locke, Kant, wrote articles, wrote books saying that the Africans have given us nothing. The Africans have no civilization, have no written traditions, were illiterate savages. The Enlightenment philosophers' views were instrumental in justifying the slave trade, because they propagated this idea that Africans were subhumans, and therefore taking them into captivity was perfectly acceptable. Should be pointed out, of course, that the people in Timbuktu back then also participated in the slave trade. So this wasn't specific to the European point of view. But anyway, Abdel Kader was determined to rescue this lost tradition. So he was hired in 1984 by the Ahmed Baba Center, which was a government-owned library funded by governed by the royal families of Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. he was hired to go out. He was a bit reluctant at first. He said to me, I wanted to go into business. His father had actually become a fairly wealthy man, trading livestock and grain, as well as maintaining his own private library. Abdel Kader kind of leaned towards the money-making side of his father's career, but was persuaded by the chief librarian, who appealed to his sense of national duty and his love of books, to go out, hit the road. And this guy really did hit the road. He went out, spent the next 12 years of his life traveling by camel, on foot, by riverboat, through desert, along the Niger River. I actually forgot to just give you a little sense of what these books look like. So let's quickly flip through these, and I'll continue Abdel Kader's story very briefly. So this actually appears as the end piece in my book, because I think it's one of the most beautiful pieces. I believe this is a Quran from the 16th century, and you can see gold leaf, earth colors derived from minerals, from insects, from plants. Because of the prohibitions in Islam against representations of the human form, they resorted to instead these incredibly intricate patterns that were meant to kind of demonstrate the universality, the harmony of existence under God. And this is a book, I believe, of a diagram possibly of poetry. One of the things about the manuscripts is that very few of them have been translated into English, so unless you can read classical Arabic, you're kind of lost. But you can still appreciate the beauty of these books. Some really extraordinary works. I mean, and we're talking thousands and thousands of these. So back to Abdel Kader, this is the kind of landscape. This is the road to Timbuktu. If you can even imagine there's a road there. It's basically just a sand track that runs for 100 miles through to the very edge of the Sahara from southern Mali. He was traveling for years across this kind of landscape, getting clues about books. Hey, I hear there's a Qadi, a traditional judge in a village on the Niger River 100 miles from Timbuktu, who has a box in a hidden storage room which has a Quran from the 12th century. He would get these clues, and then he'd head off on these incredible journeys that sometimes lasted a month, carrying lots of cash, bargaining, developed a keen sense of books, of the worth of these volumes. Again, more of kind of the landscape of this part of the world. This is called the La Dune Rose, the pink dune along the Niger River, a 90-foot sand dune towering over the stream. Traveling by riverboat, a little bit better than this. I mean, they had motors at least, along the Niger for days and weeks, and managed to amass an incredible collection. 300 by the end. Personally, probably about 100,000 works for the Ahmed Babad Center. After that, he developed his own library based on the books that he had had been in his family for generations. By this point, it was incredible. He had the ultimate networker. He had managed to establish great connections with European, Middle Eastern, American foundations. Money was rolling in. Libraries were being founded. By 2001, the sort of golden age he had really recreated, to a modest extent, the golden age of Timbuktu. There were 50 libraries, 377,000 volumes recollected by Abdel Kader and other librarians who emulated him, who he helped to acquire funds from, as I said, from Dubai, from Kuwait, from Belgium, from the Netherlands. People were kind of excited by this idea, cultural. At this time, it was a time to when people were sort of rediscovering the cultural bounty of Africa. And so people were only too happy to bring in, to encourage this renaissance. Next stage in the story, 2012. Actually, let's take it back to 2011. There had been, simultaneous with this renaissance in the desert, cultural renaissance, which also included a musical renaissance. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the music of Mali, but it was exploding not only across Europe and to some extent the US at this time, but within Mali. There was a festival that had been created in 2001 called the Festival in the Desert, to which people like Robert Plant of Led Zeppelin, Jimmy Buffett, Bono were coming and playing, and so this was getting publicity, and people were coming from all around the world. Up to, when I visited in 2009, 5,000 Westerners descended on this outdoor three and a half day festival in the dunes west of Timbuktu. I mean, it was an amazing time in this desolate place that I had visited in 1995, completely cut off from the world, transformed in the course of a decade, less than a decade, into this happening town on the edge of the Sahara. 2011, the Arab Spring happened, including the downfall of Muammar Gaddafi. In the years before that, you had this Islamist movement percolating in the Sahara, as Islamist movements tend to do in parts of the world where there is poor government, where there's a lot of poverty, where there's very little infrastructure, very little security. Islamist extremists love a vacuum, and that's what the Sahara and the area around Timbuktu offered. So in addition to the fact that you had Saudi money pouring into this area to try to encourage the spread of Wahhabist Islamist philosophy. So that had begun to take hold. Then you had a lot of rebels from radicals from Algeria who had fought a very nasty, bloody civil war in the 1990s, coming into Mali, kidnapping Westerners, selling them for ransom, making big bucks, $116 million earned by this group Al Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb in between about 2004, let's call it, and 2011. That in turn allowed them to buy weapons, to recruit fighters from across North Africa and the Middle East. All this was going on simultaneous with this cultural flowering in the desert. So you had these two different dynamics happening simultaneously. What changed the whole dynamic completely was 2011, was the Arab Spring, getting back to that. Gaddafi's regime fell. You may remember Gaddafi was killed, I think, in July or August 2011. The armories were opened up, chaos. The NATO had been in there and bombed the hell out of Gaddafi, but nobody kind of thought about what the consequences would be. I think Obama said recently that his biggest regret as president was not foreseeing what would happen post-Gaddafi. Well, this is what happened. This was one of the many unintended consequences of the fall of Gaddafi, which is that you had Islamists flooding into Libya, grabbing these weapons that were basically free for the taking in the armories. And you also had these Tuareg rebels, the nomadic rebels who've been fighting for generations for their own independent state in northern Mali. They got involved in the act too. These were secular rebels, but they found a commonality of purpose with Al Qaeda, all grabbed guns, and then in rapid succession took over the north of Mali. The government fell. Timbuktu fell on April 1st, 2012. This is a photo of a Sufi shrine, which was destroyed by Al Qaeda in July 2012 as a foretaste of what was going to happen in this. As they declared Sharia law, they began amputating hands and amputating feet, stoning people to death. Let me go back there, and making life extremely difficult for the residents of Timbuktu and across the north. At this point, this is when the final act of my story unfolds, which is the incredibly elaborate, though low-tech smuggling operation that Abdel Kader Haidara then engaged in, because he believed that at some point, although they had not specifically threatened to destroy these manuscripts, he was all but certain that the jihadists at some point would target them, because he saw what they stood for, as well as many other people saw, as anathema, as heretical, as antithetical to everything that is in accordance with Wahhabist philosophy. So Abdel Kader then embarked upon this incredibly elaborate effort using a network of smugglers, volunteers, fellow BAD-ASS librarians, relatives, etc., to smuggle these by road, by boat, along the Niger River, to the safety of Bamako. The last stages of this period were in early 2013, when the French military invaded the country, and then the whole north became a war zone. So the final act was the continuing of the smuggling operation as French troops and French aircraft were bombing the hell out of the north, destroying the jihadis, but also putting these manuscripts in grave, grave danger. These are some shots I took about 4 months after the French invaded and swept the jihadis out. In their final act of vengeance, exactly what Abdel Kader foretold or feared would happen, in fact happened, which was that the jihadists grabbed every manuscript they could find that was left in the city and burned them. And this is a picture I took, again, about probably, let's say August 2013. So about 6 months after the war in the north ended and the jihadis had been thrown out of Timbuktu and out of the cities into the desert. Many killed, some still around. But in their final act, this is what they left behind. This is the Ahmed Baba Institute, the government-owned library, which they attacked and gathered every manuscript that had been left behind that Abdel Kader had not been able to save and destroyed. And this is the aftermath of all this. This is what happened. This is what's basically keeping Timbuktu safe right now, are these guys. This is a West African peacekeeping force under the United Nations umbrella. These guys were leaving Timbuktu in August 2013 after serving a few months. They were going on R&R. I think these guys are from the Burkina Faso, and I was heading across the Niger River to visit Timbuktu to start my reporting on this book project. And you can see kind of an interesting shot. Guy over here thinks he's storming the beach at D-Day, but it was they basically were and continue to be the only security that this desolate city has protecting it. That essentially is the arc of the story. Now I just thought I'd give you a little bit of a sense of the book. I'm going to read a couple. I've been going for about 33 minutes, so let me read 2 passages from this book that will kind of give you a taste of Abdel Kader. And the first one is, which I found has had a good response, gives a sense of his bargaining efforts. So Abdel Kader would go out into the bush and he would bargain with the locals. As I said, he would get these clues about the existence of these manuscripts and would track them down, and then he'd have to enter into these negotiations. It was a very difficult thing. The first thing, people, and I should point this out, I don't think I mentioned in my talk, that people were fearful. These manuscripts had over the centuries been dispersed through families. There had been a succession of attacks on Timbuktu by 19th century jihadists. The French colonizers had come in and captured the area and held it for 70, 80 years. Manuscripts were highly sought after by the French. They had been, the French had grabbed them, stolen many beautiful works, whisked them off to libraries in Paris and elsewhere in France. So by the time Abdel Kader came around, and I neglected to tell you this part of the story and why what he was doing in the first place, they had been dispersed throughout the desert. They had left their original home in Timbuktu. As I said, families would pass them down to generations of sons and daughters, so they would be dispersed through the families, and then because of this fear of losing them, they would be further dispersed and buried in the sand and hidden in storage rooms in villages and towns all through the Niger, all through upper northern Mali. So by the time Abdel Kader came and had to try to find these works, there was a lot of fear out there. People were extremely reluctant to surrender what they viewed as their family heirlooms and valuable collections. So he had a great amount of difficulty at first getting a hold of these things. But his techniques improved, and he was able to get more and more, he was able to figure out ways of encouraging people and became more and more successful. So this is a typical scene of Abdel Kader at work. People also sensed that Haidara was playing fair. After nearly being run out of Ghorma Rarous, the first town he visited, Haidara returned there a year later. On his first afternoon back in town, a Tuareg nomad in his 40s, a gaunt man in a ragged turban with half a dozen children playing around him in the sand, called out to him in greeting as he passed by his tent. "Come inside," he cried. Haidara entered the traditional dwelling, stitched together from goat skins, and sat on the ground in the semi-darkness. He noticed a metal chest at the rear of the tent, the type normally used to hold manuscripts. "You come from where?" said the Tuareg. "I'm from Timbuktu," replied Haidara in Tamashek, the language of the Tuaregs. In addition to his native Songhai, he was conversant in Pule and Tamashek, the two other main languages of Mali's north, as well as French, and thus had no problem negotiating with manuscript owners across the region. Haidara made small talk, and seeing that the Tuareg was too poor even to offer his visitor a cup of tea, he offered to purchase some food and drink for him and his family. Haidara ran out to the market and returned with half a slaughtered lamb and a kilogram bag of tea. The Tuareg grilled the lamb outside the tent, and as they sat eating in the sand with the man's family, Haidara gently broached the subject of the manuscripts. "I don't have any of those," the Tuareg said. "I only have printed books." "Can I take a look?" asked Haidara. "Why not?" Haidara opened the trunk and poured through the volumes. Buried among the printed material was one work that caught his eye, a Quran from the 17th century. He looked through it carefully, noting the delicate Maghrebi letters, the fragile gilt that caught the late afternoon light filtering through the tent flap. It was, Haidara realized, a masterpiece. "How much do you want for this?" asked Haidara. "Whatever you want to give me," the owner said, shrugging. "You have to name your price." "Give me 5,000 CFA, or about $10, the nomad said. It was a pitifully low sum. Haidara could not accept it. They bargained, but this time the buyer was bidding up the price. No, this treasure has a huge value," he replied. 10,000 CFA. "No," Haidara said. 20,000. Haidara gave him 100,000 CFA. The man received the money wide-eyed. "If I've got more books like that, will you pay for them?" he asked. "Of course." At 5 o'clock the morning after that, in total darkness, Haidara heard a knock on his door. "Who's that?" Haidara said. The Tuareg entered his room carrying a large camel skin sack. Wordlessly, he dumped a pile of manuscripts on the ground. In the murkiness before dawn, Haidara could barely see what was lying there, but at 6 o'clock, golden light filtered through his window, illuminating magnificent treasure. When Haidara stepped outside the hut later that morning, he stared in astonishment. Tuaregs from across the region had formed a long line in front of his door, bearing camel and sheepskin sacks stuffed with manuscripts. Many had been hidden in caves or holes in the sand for decades. Haidara handed out the equivalent of thousands of dollars. Kuwait and Saudi Arabia had subsidized the effort and left with more than 1,000 manuscripts. He had paid the sellers everything they had demanded and even more. He had taken everything they had. Haidara headed back upriver to Timbuktu, his boat riding low in the water, weighed down with footlockers and piles of camel-skin sacks. In Timbuktu, Mahmoud Zubair, the library curator, looked on with astonishment. "You found all that?" he said. In his first year of work at the Ahmed Baba Institute, Haidara managed to acquire as many manuscripts as the previous team of 8 prospectors had collected in a decade. So I'm going to read one more section, I think, that will give you another look at Abdel Kader and his methods. Basically, after 12 years of doing this, he gotten a bit tired. It was grueling work, obviously, well paid for Malian standards, but grueling. He wanted to get married. He wanted to settle down. He was spending 3/4 of his life on the road in these incredibly treacherous and grueling journeys. He wanted to create his own library, as I'd mentioned earlier. His family had been collecting these for centuries. So he informed the curator, who he'd become very attached to, that he wanted to go out on his own. Then he began casting around for money. He needed money, obviously, to do this. Wrote to about 100 different organizations across the world and got absolutely nowhere. Until Henry Louis Gates of Harvard University came along. Now Gates, of course, had become, was one of America's foremost scholars, had spent much of his life trying to show the world trying to move America and the world away from a Eurocentric literary outlook and show that Africa actually had been a center of literary tradition that was completely lost. And so he set out in 1996 to make a documentary about, with PBS and BBC backing, about Timbuktu, about African culture, and arrived in Timbuktu in 1996 and began hearing stories about this collector in this town. And this is how a fateful meeting between East and West took place, between Africa and the developing world and the developed world took place. So Gates gets to Timbuktu and shows up and with a certain plan, has never heard of Haidara, has a certain plan of going to the mosque and filming there. But when they reach their hotel, their translator guide, an acquaintance of Haidara, approached them with a different proposal. If you want to see a real library, he said, these books are held mostly in private hands, and there is a man I know who might be willing to show you his collection. Gates, intrigued, changed his itinerary, and he and the film crew followed his guide through the back alleys to Haidara's house. Haidara, meanwhile, was growing despondent. The library he had dreamed of creating for 5 years was going nowhere. More than 100 foundations had turned down his proposal, and he had run out of ideas. A big delegation of Americans is here in Timbuktu, Gates's guide informed Haidara on the morning of the Harvard professor's arrival. They want to visit you. They want to see your manuscripts, so be ready. Haidara sensed that the visit could be an opportunity for him. Fine, he replied. I'll prepare something for them. Haidara laid down a carpet and gathered the best manuscripts in his Timbuktu collection. Gates and the film crew arrived later that day. As the crew filmed, Gates leafed through a treatise on astronomy, a ledger book that recorded slave transactions, and other works. These are books written by black people, Gates asked Haidara in a scene captured on camera. Haidara, a bushy-haired and youthful 33-year-old, nods. When I was growing up, Gates replies, shaking his head in amazement, the school book said that Africans couldn't read and write and didn't have any books. For hours, Haidara gave Gates a tutorial on Timbuktu's literary heritage, describing the rise of the University of Sankare and its illustrious roster of biographers, jurists, and historians, enumerating the 12 important families that had accumulated most of Timbuktu's manuscripts during its golden age, chronicling the invasion by Morocco that drove most of these volumes underground, and explaining the role played by descendants of Timbuktu's collectors who had protected the works for 400 years. It was one of the most moving days of my life, Gates recalled. I was so emotional holding these books in my hands. Not a word was spoken about Haidara's stymied plans to build a library, but Gates left his encounter convinced that he had to do something to preserve the manuscripts. Unprotected in neglected storage rooms, many were turning to dust or being devoured by termites, and some had already been lost. It was a bone-dry climate in Timbuktu, so he was lucky, Gates said. If they'd been stored in the humidity of Nigeria, they would have turned to mush long ago. When he returned to the United States, Gates informed the project director at the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation in New York City of the amazing discovery he had made in Timbuktu. All of these books still exist. This guy has them, and they're not even in a library, he said. 3 months later, on the strength of Gates's recommendation, the Mellon Foundation awarded Haidara a grant of nearly $100,000 for the creation of a new manuscript center in Timbuktu. The money came with strings attached. Mellon required the collector to create a digital archive before moving ahead with the physical construction. I know you want to build a library, but the cataloging and digitization have to come first, Gates emphasized. Haidara expressed his gratitude. Then he hired an architect and construction crew and built the library anyway. What? Gates said when Haidara informed him several months later that the library was complete. I told you that you needed to catalog first. We can't do that without first having a building, Haidara replied. He argued that the manuscripts had been exposed to the elements and imperiled in their dusty storage rooms, and that his first priority was to protect them. Exasperated and fearing a scandal, Gates reported the misuse of the grant money to the Mellon Foundation. They grumbled about it, but the attitude, says Gates, was, what's done is done. A few months later, Haidara again called Gates at Harvard. What is it? Asked Gates, still annoyed by Haidara's high-handedness. I need another grant to build another library, Haidara said. What? Gates exclaimed once more. It's amazing that you got a grant to begin with. I know, Haidara said, but there was a slight miscalculation. What are you talking about? We built it in the floodplain. We have to rebuild it. As Haidara explained it, after many years of little or no rainfall in Timbuktu, he and his construction team had taken for granted that the building site was secure. But that year, a once-in-a-generation series of rainstorms had struck the region. Rainwater had deluged the rooms, cracked the cement, and caused the roof to collapse. Everything is filled with water, he told Gates. Luckily, Haidara had not yet started moving his manuscripts into the new library, and they had all been spared. Gates, mortified, went back to the Mellon Foundation. You remember that library in Timbuktu that was built without your authorization? With your money, he asked the program officer. Yes, he replied. Well, we've got to build it again. The program director just laughed. The whole situation was so, quote, absurd, unquote, said Gates, and Haidara's demand for more money so audacious that it evoked more amusement than outrage. The Mellon Foundation decided to come through with the extra funding, and the Ford Foundation contributed money as well. A new building soon rose on the site, this one built with reinforced concrete and with its foundation raised several feet off the ground. On January 13th, 2000, in a ceremony attended by many luminaries, the Mama Haidara Commemorative Library officially opened its doors to the world. Well, that was in 2000, and of course that was a high point for Haidara, and the next few years would be glory years for him as he watched this culture kind of rise out of the desert and begin to attract more and more money and generate more and more interest, and it became sort of an avalanche. Tourists begat more media interest, which begat more money. All, of course, came crashing down in 2012 with the takeover of Timbuktu. And I'm going to save the smuggling operation for your own reading. But of course, that forms basically the last 40% of the book as this elaborate, dangerous operation to remove the books under the noses of the Al-Qaeda occupiers unfolds with a still, well, I would say with a happy, tentatively happy result, but not, but somewhat ambiguous, given everything that's going on in that part of the world right now. So at this point, 48 minutes, I'd be happy to take some questions from anybody who's got one.
How long were you developing the book?
So I'd been traveling to Mali just out of my own interest over, I visited in 1995 on a lark, as I said, then 2006, 2008 I went there to do a whole bunch of stuff. I was there for 3 weeks. I did a story on the festival, on other projects, went back to Timbuktu, couldn't find Haidara at that time. He had but I went and saw his library and saw how that had developed. And then came back again in 2013 with when the French invaded, because I knew so many people there that when the jihadists took over, of course I was then thinking, well, what has happened to those I wondered what had happened. It was hard to get any information out of the north, So it was just like a vacuum. So I guess it was around that trip in 2013 that I started to begin to think about a book, but it wasn't necessarily this book. It was just a book about this dramatic takeover of the north in Mali, and maybe I would follow some of the characters I knew, the head of the music festival. It was all vaguely formed at that point. And then I found out about the manuscripts, what had happened to them. I managed to track down that story, and then that became sort of the most interesting element of the book, of any book idea. So I actually then went back in August 2013 to write for Smithsonian about that rescue effort. And by then, that was when I said, yeah, this story with all the background and Haidara's life and the jihadists, the rise of jihadism in Africa, in North Africa. I said, all these elements have the makings of a real tale. So the book really began to form then, and then 2 more trips followed to Mali to kind of both piece together Abdel Kader's biography and then to go up to the north and find out what had happened, because that story was also pretty much unknown. Some people had gone up with the French, brief blip on the news screen, but I wanted to go up there and spend like a couple of weeks there and meet people and just get that whole account of what it was like to live under, Islamist Al-Qaeda occupation for almost a year, where they were building this caliphate. Because I thought that was an important part of the story, so you could kind of understand what the dangers that the BAD-ASS librarians were up against. So it needed to be made as visceral and concrete as possible. Yeah.
So I had a question in fact. So for the families that were preserving these manuscripts, you mentioned a lot of them are in classical Arabic.
Yeah.
So did they know the contents of the manuscripts, or just the fact that they were historic, what they had?
Most of them didn't know, actually, because Arabic had been kind of, although at one time it was the lingua franca of that part of the world, the French conquerors came in Arabic fell by the wayside. French became the language that people had to learn in high schools. Those who went to school, which is, especially up in the north, is not a great number. You know, I think it has one of the highest, ironically, this region that's produced some of the greatest literature in Africa has one of the highest illiteracy rates on the continent. So yeah, I mean, there was scholarship, there were people, but the people who learned Arabic tended to be those who, it was kept inside the family, passed down, or they traveled abroad, maybe learned in Cairo or whatever. It was a very small percentage of them who actually knew what they had, Yeah. Yeah.
What's it like there now? Is any of that culture from the early 21st century been resurrected? Do the libraries still exist?
The libraries exist, and the Ahmed Baba Center, where is still a pretty impressive. I mean, the South African government built that. It's like a $8 million structure, and I think there are a couple of curators, trying to basically just keep the building from falling completely to pieces. And I'm sure that Abdel Kader's library, which is also a really impressive, more modest building, but impressive still. I know he's got a curator on hand, keeping it in shape. The manuscripts there are no manuscripts in there. Well, the Ahmed Baba Center there were about 10,000 books in the opposite. The big Ahmed Baba Center was taken over by the jihadis early on and turned into a barracks. So when the smugglers went to work trying to sneak books out of the city, they couldn't go in there. Basically, they figured everything in there was going to be lost. And in fact, that's where they torched those 4,000 that I showed some pictures of the scraps. But 10,000 of them were in the basement and in a climate-controlled room, locked doors, and the jihadis, even though they lived there for 8 months, they never found out about them. So those were all preserved. But again, like 99% of those manuscripts are down in Bamako now, and the libraries are standing, but they're empty, and probably, some of them are falling apart. But the idea is that one day, when things are safe enough in Timbuktu, they'll be able to bring all the books, all the manuscripts back and reopen the libraries, inshallah. I mean, who knows when that day will happen, yeah. Well, the Ahmed Baba Center's books have been digitized. All those manuscripts there've been a big program funded by the South Africans to not only to restore the actual works, but to digitize them. But that Ahmed Baba Center really comprises a small percentage of this overwhelming 400,000. And I think the majority of those have not been digitized. There's a plan intact now. They're all kind of sitting in storage rooms and climate-controlled rooms, but there's no they're just storage facilities, and I don't know if there are laboratories I really don't know what's going on in that regard. Abdel Kader was supposed to be getting money together. I did read that there is this, interestingly enough, a monk, a Minnesota-based monk, who has been, and I may even go off and try to do something about him. There's a piece in The Economist about him. He's had a long interest in manuscripts from the Middle East. He did preserve the manuscripts of Homs and Aleppo before the war. And I believe he has made contact with Abdel Kader Haidara, and I think that he is certainly begun this digitization process. He's visited Bamako a few times. I think I heard that he's on his way there now. So he might be the only one actually actively doing this now. But his specialty is in fact digitization of works. He's got into it through medieval Italian, Catholic manuscripts, and then kind of gradually expanded his interest. So yeah, I'd be interested to find out what he's up to.
Having said that, thanks a lot for speaking with us today and sharing the inspirational story. Thank you.
You're welcome.